Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi's 10 munjiyat, or those 10 aspects that a person should, those spiritual aspects a person should work on in order to safeguard oneself and draw one close to Allah Almighty and receive salvation in this life and the hereafter. We covered the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and now we'll come to the sixth. We've just come over the halfway line. 4 more after this, inshallah. And the sixth one is, which is today's lecture, is ikhlas and sidq, which is sincerity and truthfulness. The hadith that I mentioned just now, a little short while ago, Imam Abu Abdullah Muhammad bin Ismail al-Bukhari, rahmatullah alayhi, the author of Sahih al-Bukhari, he mentions this hadith right at the beginning of his book. And the point he's conveying is that sincerity in actions, ikhlasun niyat, sincerity in actions is the root and the basis of everything. And this beautiful hadith that he mentions at the beginning of his Sahih is that actions are according to intentions. And it's something that comes across time and again, time and again, time and again. And Hazrat Shaykh al-Hadith, Maulana Muhammad Zakaria Khandalvi rahmatullah alayhi, Hazrat Shaykh rahmatullah alayhi, the author of Fazail Amal, Fazail Sadaqat, and many of the books, he mentions in his Abiti, his autobiography, a story. He mentions that he had a visitor in Ramadan, Ra'isul Ahrar, Maulana Habibur Rahman Ludhianvi rahmatullah alayhi, a great freedom fighter. He was the Ra'is of Ahrar, he was a great freedom fighter, politician, a graduate of Darul Deoband. But he was also a murid of Hazrat Maulana Abdul Qadir Raipuri rahmatullah alayhi. And it would be the case that people who would visit Maulana Abdul Qadir Raipuri rahmatullah alayhi would often stop by as a Shaykh rahmatullah alayhi's house or at the madrasa to visit him and to say that they're going to Raipur. And then they would ask if there's a message, and he would say, convey my salam to Maulana Abdul Qadir Raipuri rahmatullah alayhi. And they would go there, and they would do this. Why? Because there were so many people there in the Khanqa of Raipur with Maulana Abdul Qadir Raipuri. If they said, as a Shaykh rahmatullah gives salam, they would make them sit close to them. So in order to gain those brownie points, people used to come. One day, Maulana Habibur Rahman came, and he said to him, I have a question for you, but I don't want you to answer it now. You can answer it when I come back and think about the answer, but I have a question for you which I just don't understand. And he had a genuine question about tasawwuf, about Sufism. He said, what is tasawwuf? What is all this Sufism? You know, people don't understand what Sufism is. What is tasawwuf? What is tazkiyatul qulub? As a Shaykh Rahmatullah alayhi's Ramadan, it's a lot lengthier story, there's a lot more to it than that. I'll just say very short. He said that tasawwuf is, the beginning of tasawwuf is innamal a'malu bin niyat, that a person's actions is completely in tune with what Allah Almighty wants. And its ending is an ta'bud Allah ka'annaka tarahu, that you worship Allah as if that you're seeing Him. Then Maulana Habibur Rahman Ludhianvi rahmatullah, he was a murid, but maybe not so active as they say. He then became more active, and eventually he got khilafat from Hazrat Raipuri rahmatullah alayhi, and he was one of the great freedom fighters of, against the colonialism and imperialism and the occupation at that time in India. So anyway, so this story that they mentioned, tasawwuf, the root of tasawwuf, which our Akabir mentioned, is ikhlas. The beginning of it is ikhlas. If a person performs 100 years of worship, but there's no ikhlas in it, then what's the use? But it's about gaining that ikhlas and sincerity, and that's the basis of tasawwuf. I don't know, Hazrat Maulana Abdul Hafiz Sahib rahmatullah alayhi used to often say that tasawwuf ke koi tabadul nahi hai. He used to say that there is nothing that can replace tasawwuf. All the shobha of deen are correct. Everything is correct. Everything is part of deen. But when it comes to the purification of the heart, there is nothing that can replace tasawwuf. The other shobha of deen are also necessary. People that do welfare work, the madrasas, the masajid, the establishing of khanqas, the establishing of madrasas, masajid, and also the propagation of deen and dawat and tabligh. All of this is right, and there's nothing that can replace them. In the same way, when it comes to tasawwuf, tasawwuf is also something nothing can replace. Yes, there's overlap, but there's nothing to replace it. That's the importance of tasawwuf. Anyway, Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi in this section, I've just summarized it very quickly. He mentions that there are 3 aspects of sincerity. When it comes to sincerity, there's three aspects. And he touches on all three in a very short way. He mentions number one is the root and the basis of ikhlas, yeah, which is the intention. When it comes to sincerity, the root and the basis is the person's intention. This is where ikhlas actually lies. The second is, he mentions the reality or haqiqat of tasawwuf, of ikhlas. And he summarizes it and he says that the reality and the haqiqat, the truthfulness of sincerity is that there shouldn't be anything that's admixtured, anything that's polluted one's intention. It should only be for the sake of Allah Almighty. There should be nothing else there that's polluted it in any way. And then the third point that he mentions, I'll just mention what he says, is perfect ikhlas, kamal, the truthfulness. That's a bit of a more complicated section. I'm not going to go into detail. But first of all, what does niyat mean? What does it mean by niyat in istilah, in the terminology and the nomenclature of the ulama? It means that seeking of pleasure of Allah Almighty. Allah, and then he after that brings a number of hadith. One of the hadiths that he brings is in the Mal'amalu bin Niyat, which I just explained. Then he mentions another hadith, beautiful hadith, in which Allah Almighty, in which he says, إِنَّ الْمَلَائِكَةَ تَرْفَعُ صَحِيفَةَ عَمَلِ الْعَبْدِ فَيَقُولُ اللَّهُ تَعَالَى أَلْقُوهَا فَإِنَّهُ لَمْ يُرِدْ بِهَا وَجْهِ. That indeed the angels, they raise and they bring up sahifata, the book, the sahifa, the book of the actions of the slave. So Allah Almighty, when he says, send it back. فَإِنَّهُ لَمْ يُرِدْ بِهَا وَجْهِ. For indeed with his actions that he carried out, he didn't intend my pleasure and my happiness. It wasn't me that he wanted, it was something else. He did the ibadat to show other people. He did the ibadat so that it may be said such a thing. وَاكْتُبُوا لَهُ كَذَا وَكَذَا. Write for him this and this and this. فَتَقُولُ الْمَلَائِكَةُ, the angels will say, إِنَّهُ لَمْ يَعْمَلْ مِنْهَا شَيْئًا. He didn't do any of this. So Allah Azza wa Jalla says, إِنَّهُ نَوَاهُ. Indeed, he didn't do it, you think he didn't do it for this, but he intended. So, sorry, I missed something out. فَإِنَّهُ لَمْ يُرِدْ بِهَا وَجْهِ. He didn't intend my pleasure. And then another person's sahifa, his book of deeds is raised up. So Allah Almighty then says, "Uktubu lahu kada wa kada." That write for him this and this. Yani on top of the reward that he's getting, write for him extra reward. Write for him this as well, this as well, this as well. The angels say, but he didn't actually do this. He sat in a masjid and he prayed 2 rakat salah. But then at the same time, you're giving him sawab for protecting his eyes. You're giving him sawab for safeguarding his time. So many other things that you're giving him sawab for and ajr for. Allah Almighty then says, but indeed he did intention for all of these things. Nabi Kareem Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam says in the hadith, An-nasu arba'a, that the people are 4 types. Rajulun atahu Allahu ilman wa mala. A person, Allah Almighty gives him ilm, knowledge and wealth. فَهُوَ يَعْمَلُ بِعِلْمِهِ فِي مَالِهِ. Then he acts according to his knowledge in his wealth. So Allah Almighty is giving him wealth and he's got knowledge as well. And with his knowledge he understands that his wealth, at the end of the day, the bank account that's really going to count is the bank account of the hereafter, not the bank account of dunya. So what he does is, he uses his knowledge to spend his money in gaining ajr and thawab in the hereafter. فَيَقُولُ رَجُلٌ. There's another person, he's got nothing in his pocket, he's poor. لَوْ آتَانِ. He says, لَوْ آتَانِ اللَّهُ مَا آتَاهُ. If Allah Almighty, if only Allah Almighty gave me what he gave him, لَعَمِلْتُ كَمَا يَعْمَلْ. Then I would do exactly as he did. I would spend my money in the path of Allah Almighty. فَهُمَا فِي الْأَجْرِ سَوَاء. Nabi Karim Sallallahu says that both of these individuals are equal in reward. The person who gave and the person who didn't give because he didn't have anything, but his intention was the same. This is the bounty of Allah Almighty. The treasure of Allah Almighty was open. So these are 2 types of people. Then he says, وَرَجُلٌ آتَاهُ اللَّهُ مَالًا. Allah Almighty gave a person wealth. وَلَمْ يُؤْتِهِ عِلْمًا. But he didn't give him knowledge. He might have knowledge, but his knowledge is weak. فَهُوَ يَخْبِتُ بِجَهْلِهِ فِي مَالِهِ. Then, because of his ignorance, he's haphazard in his wealth. He spends it here, he spends it there. Doesn't spend it on the right things. Doesn't build the treasury of the hereafter. فَيَقُولُ رَجُلٌ. And then a person sees him and he says, لَوْ آتَانِي اللَّهُ تَعَالَى مَا آتَاهُ. If only Allah Almighty gave me what he gave him. لَعَمِلْتُ كَمَا يَعْمَلْ. Then I would also be living the the playboy lifestyle, yeah, like he's living the life. Yeah, I'd be living the way he's living. فَهُمَا فِي الْوِزْرِ سَوَاءٌ. Yani he's spending his wealth on needless things. He's going to places where he shouldn't be going. He's having relationships that he shouldn't be doing. He's doing the things he shouldn't be doing. But he's not done this action. He's not carried out the action. Why is he not carried out the action? Because he doesn't have the wealth. But he aspires to live the playboy lifestyle. فَهُمَا فِي الْوِزْرِ سَوَاءٌ. So both of them in wizr, in the burden that's going to be on their shoulder of sins and punishment, sawa, they're equal. Likewise, in another hadith, Nabi Karim sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, "Man gaza, whoever goes out and he struggles out in the path of Allah as a ghazi, وَهُوَ لَا يَنْوِي إِلَّا إِقَالًا." And he وَهُوَ لَا يَنْوِي إِلَّا إِقَالًا. And his intention is only material gains. The greatest action a person could possibly do, the fadail mentioned by the ulama, mentioned within the Quran and Hadith, and the books have been written about the reward that a person gains for struggling in that way in the path of Allah, is so great. Before the first drop of blood drops on the ground, all his sins are forgiven, straight entry into paradise. He can take into Jannah so many people, but he didn't intend actual reward and the pleasure of Allah Almighty, but his intention was iqalan, yani to gain material gains. Falahu ma nawa, for him shall be what he intended. It's also mentioned in another hadith, وَرُوِيَ أَنَّ رَجُلًا مِّن بَنِي إِسْرَائِيلَ مَرَّ بِكَثْبَانٍ مِّن رَمَلٍ فِي أَيَّامِ قَحْطٍ. A person passed from the Bani Israel, passed by dunes of sand in the days of qahad, of drought. فَقَالَ فِي نَفْسِهِ. So he said to himself, لَوْ كَانَ هَذَا الرَّمْلُ طَعَامًا. If only these dunes of sand was to be food, لَقَسَمْتُهُ بَيْنَ النَّاسِ. Then I would divide it amongst the people. فَأَوْهَى اللَّهُ تَعَالَى إِلَى نَبِيٍّ. So Allah Almighty revealed to the Prophet at that time, قُلْ لَهُ, tell him, إِنَّ اللَّهَ تَعَالَى قَدْ قَبِلَ صَدَقَتَكَ. That Allah Almighty has accepted your sadaqah. And He has been thankful for your pious intention, and He has given you the reward of that, of لَوْ كَانَ طَعَامًا فَتَصَدَّقْتَ. He has given you reward of, if this was food, then you would give it in sadaqah, you'd get the same reward. So brother, what can we say? Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi mentions all of these fadail. We know what the fadail are. We've come across this quite a few times. I mentioned that the root of ikhlas is a person's niyat and intention. But what is intention? So very cool, Imam Ghazali has actually gone over 17 pages. I've summed it up and summarized in a few pages. And I'll just quickly go over this very quickly. And there's some very, very interesting nuggets within this. First of all, Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi says, what is the reality of niyat? What is the reality of a person's intention? Niyat is to intend something. The person first of all intends something, and then he carries out the action. But the intention that he has in order to carry out the action stems from something before that, which is knowledge. A person has knowledge. He understands that if there's food there, he sees the food, and he knows that I need this food to go into my stomach to give me strength to do what I need to do. So then he makes the intention, I'm going to eat. Then he carries out the action. So the knowledge, intention, and then the action. So he says that when it comes to the action is subservient to the intention. That's number one. That's the first thing. Then he says, he goes on at this point, and he mentions something, a very interesting point. He says, when the reality and excellence of intention and a person's niyat is understood, then just by changing, you could carry on one action, but by doing certain things in a smarter way, he says, being smart, you spend £1, you want to make profit, but you spend your pound in such a way that the return is maximum. You make £500 out of it. So what he says is that there's a way of utilizing your intention in a way that not by just doing one action, you're able to get a return that's multifold, or multiple. And this is because a person can embed multiple intentions in one action. He says, then he gives a beautiful example, just by way of example. He says, you go to the masjid and salah time, there's still about an hour left for salah. You go to the masjid early, or maybe 10 minutes early, 15 minutes early, you go early, and you sit there. Yeah? Just waiting for the salah in itself is an act of worship. But he then lists 8 intentions that a person could possibly make. 8 intentions. He says, number 1, when you come to the masjid, you make intention that this is the house of Allah, and coming here to visit Allah, and coming here is to visit Allah Almighty. Coming here is to visit Allah Almighty. And then he says that Nabi Karim sallallahu alaihi wasallam says in the hadith, "Man qa'ada fil masjid," whoever sits in the masjid, faqad zara Allah ta'ala, indeed he has visited Allah Almighty. Wa haqqun ala al-muzawwir ikramu za'iri, and it's the right of the person who's been visited, Allah Almighty, to be benevolent or kind and bountiful to the person who visits him. So he mentions this. So first of all, you come to the masjid early, that's an act in itself of worship. But at the same time, you make the intention that this is the house of Allah, I'm coming to visit Allah Almighty. And you'll reap the reward of that. That's number 1. Number 2, he says, that you make the intention of being a murabit, someone who's vigilant and on guard, someone who's doing ribat. And you're acting upon the verse of the Quran Kareem where Allah Almighty says, وَصَابِرُوا وَرَابِتُوا. In other words, you're waiting for one prayer after another. That's why he explains. So this is the second thing. You'll get reward for that. The third thing, you make intention of i'tikaf. We know this. Yeah? But what is i'tikaf, he says? He says i'tikaf is stopping of the ears, the eyes and the limbs from transgressing. It's a type of fasting in itself. So you come into the masjid and you make intention of i'tikaf and you carry out the i'tikaf of those 15 minutes, 1 hour, whatever time it is, in the correct way. You stop the ears, the eyes and the limbs from transgressing. You put your phone away completely, because that's the other action that happens, and it creates a lot of sins. Number 4, khalwat, he says. Khalwat, yani a time of solitude, free from occupation, onesie time to be with Allah Almighty. This is so that you can contemplate and meditate on the hereafter and how to prepare for it. That's the 4th one. The 5th one, he says, to sit separately from the people in solitude again, but sitting separately from people, not sitting where everyone is gathering and having a chit chat, but rather to sit separately from people for dhikr yourself, or to recite the Quran in a melodious voice, or to do dhikr in a melodious voice, to make other people listen, so they get reward and you also get reward. And he mentions a hadith at this point. He says, Man ghada ila al-masjidi, whoever goes to the masjid, yazkurullah ta'ala or yudhakkiru bihi, to remember and do dhikr of Allah Almighty, or to do dhikr so that other people listen, kana kal mujahidi fi sabilillahi ta'ala, it's like the mujahid, the person who's doing jihad, a person who's striving and fighting in the path of Allah Almighty. So this is the great reward of the person who's dhikr inside the masjid. Sadis, the 6th point, he says, that to benefit people through knowledge. So you go into the masjid and your intention is to benefit other people. Yani you're doing amar bil ma'roof wa nahi anil munkar. Yani to command the good and to prevent the evil. This would be another extra reward in the hereafter. Number 7, he says, an tatruku dhunub haya'an min Allah azza wa jal, that you leave sins. You come into the masjid, is a sacred place, a sanctified place. You come into the masjid and you're abandoning sins for that period of time. And you strengthen yourself spiritually by sitting inside the masjid to build your immune system to fight off sins. So this is the 7th intention your person could make. And then he says to benefit people for the sake of Allah and the pious who often visit the masjid. Many people come into the masjid, generally people who are pious come into the masjid, and sometimes there might be people who have a zarurat, who have a need, and it might be an opportunity for you to meet somebody who has a need. Somebody's come from abroad, somebody's come from another town, they're raising funds. You use this you come to the masjid with the intention that, if there's somebody there, I'm going to put £1 inside his sadaqah box, or lillah box, or zakat box. Again, that's another reward. So Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi says, by just one little action a person carries out, coming to the masjid a little bit early, if he changes his mindset, if he thinks about things in a different way, he adds on, bolt-ons they say, add a few things on, pay £1 extra, get extra cheese on. Pay £1 extra, get some extra fries, curly fries, cheesy fries. But you just do a little bit extra, you get extra reward. He says just by changing your mindset and turning your mind towards this, you can multiply your rewards in very many ways. But on the flip side, On the flip side, Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayh, he also says on the flip side, the opposite side, very interesting. And this is Imam Ghazali, at his best. He says one sinful action can also become sinful in a multitude of ways due to lots of intentions. Yeah. So, for example, he takes the same example. You're sitting in the masjid. You come to the masjid. Yeah. You come early. But then your intention is to network with people and then maybe say the wrong things. Number one. Number two, he says you might be speaking about the other people. That's another sin. And then it might be you'll be sat at home all day, but then you might be going to the masjid on the way to masjid, you think you'll go past Newman College and satisfy the lust of the eyes, for example. Yeah? Or inside our masjid, we don't have the opposite genders, but he actually mentions in his time that you might go to the masjid with the intention of fulfilling your eyes' desires by looking at the opposite gender. So he says again, that's a third sin. And then the fourth sin, which he mentions, and this is probably specific to the ulama, he says you use it as an opportunity. The same that the ulama, you use it as an opportunity to show off your knowledge, or to use the visit to the masjid as an opportunity to debate your contemporaries and show them how great you are and how knowledgeable you are. And this is the wrong intention. So Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi, from this he mentions that a pious action, one pious action, you can embed multiple intentions inside it to gain the maximum reward. Likewise, one action on the exterior might look pious, but if it's done with the wrong intention, you can also reap multiple of sins because of that. And then he says, anything that's permissible, make multiple intentions. He says, for example, he gives another example, beautiful example. He says, let's say wearing ithr on Friday, which is a sunnah. He says a person might make intention to take pleasure from the fragrance. Yeah, he might wear expensive perfume, Versace, Oud, the limited edition, whatever it's called. Yeah, he might want to wear that. Why? Because he wants to boast of his wealth, or he might want to attract the opposite gender. Yeah. This is all sins. But the same action, if he was to do it in a different way. Number one, he wears the ithr, or he wears the perfume to follow the sunnah, to honor the house of Allah Almighty on a Friday, to respect the day of Friday, to remove difficulty from other people. Why? To dispel odors, body odors, so other people aren't troubled by this. And he also, at the same time, he makes intention that if he wears attar and he smells nice, then he also stops another person from doing ghibat about him, because if he's smelling quite a lot, then people won't like it. So he mentions all of this, and then he mentions a hadith of Nabi Karim sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, "Man tatayyaba lillah, ja'a yawm al-qiyamah, wa rihu atyabu min rih al-misk, wa man tatayyaba li ghayrillah, ja'a yawm al-qiyamah, wa rihu antanu min al-jifa." Abdul Razak mentions this in Musannaf. He says that man tatayyaba lillah, whoever wears ithr for the sake of Allah Almighty, he shall come on the day of judgment, and the fragrance that he'll be emanating on the day of judgment will be more pure, more fragrant, min rih al-musk, from the fragrance of musk. وَمَنْ تَطَيَّبَ لِغَيْرِ اللَّهِ, but whoever wears tib, whoever wears ithr for something aside from Allah, other intention, جَاءَ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ, he shall come on the day of judgment, وَرِيحُهُ أَنْتَنُ مِنَ الْجِيفَةِ, and the smell, his odor, his stench will be worse than the stench from a dead body. After that, Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi, he then mentions the second point. He says that you've got the intention, and you made the ikhlas is based in the intention, and we mentioned what intention is. The second thing is, he says that the second point is there should be no admixture. There should be no admixture, should be only for the sake of Allah Almighty. Nothing should be there. There should be no ostentation, no riyah at all inside there. And in order to support this, he mentions, Nabi Karim sallallahu alayhi wa sallam says, Al-ikhlasu sirrun min sirri, Allah Almighty says, Nabi Karim says in Hadith Qudsi, Allah Almighty says, Al-ikhlas, that in sincerity, sirrun min sirri, is a secret from my secrets, that I place in the heart of the person who I love from my slaves. Nabi Karim in another hadith says, أخلص العمل, make your actions pure. يجزيك القليل منه, only a little will be sufficient for you. That only carrying out a few actions but done with ikhlas, only for the sake of Allah Almighty, that will be sufficient for you. In this world and the hereafter. Nabi Karim Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam says in another hadith, beautiful hadith, مَا مِنْ عَبْدٍ يَخْلُصُ الْعَمَلَ 40 يَوْمًا, that there is no slave who makes sincere his actions for 40 days. Yani every single action, check. Is it for Allah or is it for some other ulterior motive? And for 40 days he carries on like this, straight on the straight and narrow path. إِلَّا ظَهَرَتْ يَنَابِيعُ الْحِكْمَةِ مِنْ قَلْبِ عَلَى لِسَانِهِ. The springs of wisdom will start overflowing from his tongue. This is some of the fadil that comes out of this. Then after that, Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayh, he mentions what is sincerity. Yeah, sincerity very simply is that the intention should be only for Allah Almighty. No riya, ostentation, nothing else should come into this. Yeah, and we mentioned what riya was and what's ostentation last year in the series of lectures that we mentioned. And one of the hadiths that we mentioned at that time was that on the day of judgment, 3 types of people will be summoned in the court of Allah Almighty: the Qari al-Quran, the Mujahid, and the Sakhi, the wealthy person. Each 3 of them will be asked, in summary, in short, that what did you do for me? The first person said, I taught the Quran my entire life. The second person, I gave my blood in the path of Allah Almighty. The third person said, I gave my wealth in the path of Allah Almighty. And Allah Almighty will say, Kadhabta, you've spoken the untruth, you've lied, but you did this for kada wa kada wa kada, you did it for this reason, this reason, this reason, and then all 3 of them individually will be sent into Jahannam with the head first. Hazrat Shaykh al-Hadith Manzakir rahmatullah alayhi, Fazail al-Sadaqat and Fazail al-Amal, time and again he keeps mentioning this hadith. Time and again, the Tabligh brothers, they know when they do the ta'aleem thoroughly as they do, they know that this hadith comes so many times. But this is the thing about ikhlas. What is the opposite of ikhlas? Ostentation, riya. Remove ostentation, remove riya, ikhlas will be achieved inshallah. But then Imam Ghazali rahmatullah alayhi says another point, just a small little point before we conclude. He mentions that sometimes a person carries out a pious action, but with the pious action he also adds a few other things onto it. And he gives the example. He says that, for example, a person fasts, but then he fasts in Ramadan, but then he also makes the intention that, I'm fasting for health benefits. Yeah, the sake of Allah and health benefits. You need to remove it, he says. He says, for example, a person might have a slave. It's very interesting. We don't have slaves in this day and age, but it's interesting because the context of what he's mentioning, you understand some of the problems that people have with slaves. So he says a person might emancipate or free a slave, but the reason why he's actually freeing a slave is fazilat and reward from Allah Almighty. But he says that the reason why a person frees the slave isn't because he wants to just get the fazilat from Allah Almighty and the fazilat and the reward that's mentioned inside the hadith, but actually this slave is a bit of a headache. Yeah, he's bad akhlaq, he's got bad manners. Yeah, I have to tell him 100 times what to do, and I have to keep on telling him, I must just get rid of the guy. Yeah, I'm not going to be able to sell him. So he gets rid of him, and let me get the reward. So there's a bit of a pollution in his intention. He says, for example, a person might go for Hajj, but he might go for Hajj for what we say, having a jolly, a trip, a holiday. Or he's running away from responsibility of his looking after his family. It happens. Or he might be running away, he's in a bit of a problem. He's in some sort of problem, so he wants to run away from it. Or he even says right at the end, or maybe he's going for Hajj because he wants to escape the weariness of his wife, and married life. He said that's not right. You should go for Hajj for the sake of going for Hajj. Then he says that person might be teaching Islamic knowledge, but he treats it like a job rather than the actual intention. He says, a person might write a page of the Quran to improve his writing, or he walks the Hajj not for getting the fazilat of every step in the path of Allah, but he's actually walking Hajj. Why? He wants to save a bit of money. Yeah? Or it might be the case that he performs wuzu to clean himself and cool himself in Ramadan, but not exactly to get the reward. So he mentions all of these things. There's a few other things. One of the other things that he mentions is that he gives sadaqah to a beggar. But the reason why he gives sadaqah to the beggar, because the guy's doing his head in. Mata pa chari gyo, as they say. So he wants to get rid of him, so he gives him some money. So Imam Ghazali rahmatullah says that all of these thoughts are contrary to sincerity, and to remove them can be difficult, but you have to try and remove them. And then the third point that he mentions is the perfect ikhlas and sincerity. That's a long discussion, and I don't think it's suitable for this majlis in itself. But just to conclude right at the end, I'll just mention two things that Hakimul Ummat, Mujaddidul Millat, Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanvi Rahmatullah Alayhi mentions. He mentions very succinct, and this is probably the nichor or the summary of everything that we've said today. Imam Hazrat Thanvi Rahmatullah Alayhi, and this is the thing about Hazrat Thanvi Rahmatullah Alayhi, people don't recognize what he actually was. And that's our fault in ourselves. Hazrat Thanvi Rahmatullah mentions two things. He says, ikhlas means to intend Allah in one's act of obedience. Only Allah. The motive must be only the proximity and good pleasure of Allah Most High. And this motive must not be contaminated by any personal motive or gain or the pleasure of others. Only Allah Almighty, sincerely, bas Allah Almighty. How to acquire, Hazrat Thanvi then says. Second point. He says how to acquire is very easy. Well, not easy, but it's very simple. He says elimination of riya, ostentation, is sincerity. To do mehnat upon one's nafs and to remove ostentation is sincerity. I pray that Allah Almighty gives us all the tawfiq and the ability to act on all of this, to bring sincerity into our actions, to bring ruhaniyat into our actions, to bring spirituality into our actions. You know, there's a funny thing that keeps coming to my mind. You know, some people say, you know, sometimes we become a ummat of, what's the word? Routine. We become a ummat of routine. And it reminds me of a Barbie doll. Yeah? A Barbie doll. You put a hijab on a Barbie doll, she just becomes a hijabi Barbie, isn't it? Yeah? But she's still plastic and silicone, should I say. Right? But ruhaniyat has to come in. Spirituality has to come in. We shouldn't just become hijabi Barbies, but we should actually become real Rabia Basriyas, Sayyidina Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, and all the great stalwarts of our deen that passed us before. And this was this spirituality that was inside them that actually made them. And we see today that, you know, we have become a bit of an ummah full of hijabi Barbies. Allah give us tawfiq. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Wa alaikum salam.